Of course, there is a great deal more in history than the drama of kings and queens. A lot of African peoples found it easy, and indeed better, to do without royal masters. Yet kingship clearly remained an important part of the story, and the facts of Africa's historical development reveal a wide variety of kingdoms and empires. Most of the old kingdoms have vanished long since, and all the old empires, but some of them have left behind, for us, magnificent reminders of their majesty and power. The cities, too, were large and impressive enough to command European respect. This was certainly true of the Hausa city of Kano, painted here by the German traveller Heinrich Barth during a visit in 1851. The Hausa people lived in a cluster of independent states north of the junction of the Niger and Benue rivers. Each state had its own capital, like Katsina or Kano. Kano today is one of the major cities of modern Nigeria, and like most of our world has lost some of its reverence for kingly power, smothered beneath the motor cars and the main roads. But Kano still has some vestiges of its ancient dignity, including parts of the old city wall. Restored and preserved behind metal barricades, some of the old gates still pierce these crumbling ramparts first built in the reign of King Tsariki during the 12th century. Modern Kano is as brash and noisy as any African city of our time, with its concrete office blocks, its traffic jams, its utterly persistent roadside vendors, and imperious police force. Although the principal mosque is modern, it's still possible to find traditional houses, side by side with the new. These old townhouses were designed to match the hot, dry climate of the Western Sudan, and Kano's trading visitors often feel at home with older ways of life. Like so much else in Nigeria today, this modern city of Kano has grown out of an ancient civilization and from a local enterprise practiced through a long period of early development. Kano's story through the centuries became one of singular drama and brilliance. Ever since the Middle Ages, this old city has been a magnet for countless travelers, a place of rest after hard journeys, a seat of scholarship and of royal power, and a market echoing with the din and traffic of the whole Western Sudan. Trade has been a major activity in Kano since early times and has grown in importance with the city itself. Some of these goods have been traded for hundreds of years, such as rock salt from the Sahara and pepper and spices from the south. And from about 1500 onwards, a new commodity, brought from the forest lands and much prized as a stimulant, kola nuts. Whether the trade was long distance or local, Kano was, as it is today, a place where there was money to be made and goods manufactured for sale. The reasons for Kano's prosperity go back to the origins of the city. This small hill, so barren and so empty, contains within its past another of the surprises of African history. To reach its secret, we have to go back more than 1,000 years. At that time, before or about AD 900, people came and settled and began to build a little town here on this hill, which they called Dala. To begin with, Dala was just another hill settlement, a source of iron ore and a place of refuge, otherwise no more important than many other small villages scattered across Hausa land. The early history of the region tells of rivalry between these villages, and Kano, well placed to take advantage of the natural wealth of the region, gradually emerged as the most powerful settlement in its area. According to the Kano Chronicle, an ancient record of remembered history, the early kings then set about extending their rule. One by one they outmaneuvered their rivals and absorbed their lands, much like the warring barons of feudal Europe. The royal palace, Gedan Runfa, was built in the 15th century, but the ritual pomp and circumstance of the court dates from much earlier times. Preceded by women praise singers who tell the world of his power and glory, the King of Kano emerges from the inner palace for his daily round of public duties. For centuries, the court has been run by a small army of officials, some born in service, others descended from noble families. In the old days, these officials ensured that limits were placed on the power of the king.
He had his council, consisting of 4 traditional kingmakers. These were the Madaki of Kano, the Makama of Kano, the Sarkin Dawaki Metuta of Kano, and the Sarkin Bai of Kano, which of course is myself. And they used to give advice to the emir on all matters.
The person of the king himself was shrouded in mystery. Even the simple action of sitting down on his throne had to be concealed from public gaze. Only then could lesser chiefs draw near to pay elaborate homage. The king's face and most of the rest of his person were obscured from public view. His royal feet were not supposed to touch the ground. The ostrich feather sandals were part of his exclusive regalia. But in spite of all this prestige, there were strict limits to the king's authority. The 4 kingmakers had the power to choose the heir to the throne from any one of the male children of the royal family. The king was dependent on the cooperation of a large hierarchy of lesser chiefs. This was a kind of constitutional monarchy. The power of the nobles was checked by the authority of slave officials appointed by the king. These were not slaves in the modern sense, but much more like the royal retainers of European monarchs. Kano even had its own jester, licensed to tell awkward truths when others preferred tactful silence. But there were other royal servants with great authority. A leading nobleman of Kano, the Makaman.
Well, slave officials, there were 4, 2. That is Shamakin Kano, Salama, Dairini, and Kilishi, slaves.
Although men of noble birth might still call them slaves, these royal servants, just like the king's men of European monarchs, could wield decisive influence. One of the most powerful of them was an official still known as the Shamaki.
Gidan kansa a gidan hannunsa yake, da mugudancin da yake shamaki da wanda ke kofar gidan shamaki. Duk a hannun shamaki suke, babu ruwansu da sarki, sarki ba ruwansu da shi. Ɗaya in sarki zai nema sai ce a faɗa shamaki, wani aimar kaza kaza.
The Shamaki was responsible for the royal stables. Today there are only a few horses, but cavalry were once vital to the security of the state. The cavalry were the armoured divisions of their time. Even today the royal horses are valued so highly that they're fed every morning by hand. The Shamaki's position was one of crucial trust because whoever controlled the cavalry controlled the kingdom. But he himself owed his position directly to the king's patronage. Only a foolish official would bite the hand that feeds him. Another so-called slave official was the Salama. The Salama had responsibility for the royal arsenal, and he had direct access to the king.
Wanda sarki amincewa, wato abu ne amincewa ne ga sarki don za a je ya same shi a cikin gidansa. Kowane lokaci na da izinin da zai shiga ya sami sarki a gida. Aikin sallama da wannan amanar da na gaya maka ta gidansa, da amanar abin gaba kamar su bindiga, su kibiya, su lufudda, to duk ikon salama ne.
Guns were rare in Old Kano, and the king did his best to monopolize them for his royal bodyguard of musketeers. These were housed in the palace itself. Gunpowder is still manufactured in the palace arsenal, but it's only issued today for festivals and celebrations. Control of the bodyguard is vested in the Salama. This parade may be a bit of a joke, but the power once exercised by these appointed officials was real enough. Their task was to safeguard the security of the state. Early Kano had its own religion. Its beliefs involved ancestors, local spirits, and various natural forces. Many of these beliefs centered on a cult which endures to this day, known as Bori. The Bori ritual is extremely old. This form of it, nowadays little more than a popular entertainment, still carries an echo of its old magical persuasion. Over the centuries, as Kano's links with the outside world increased, the spirit cults gradually declined. They gave way to the modernizing influence of a world religion, Islam. Islam came here 1,000 years ago, but its real impact began with the arrival of Muslim traders from Mali around the year 1300. These were the Wangarawa, whose learning and prosperity reinforced the teachings of the Quran. Slowly, Muslim influence widened until the great majority of the Kano people, led by their king, answered the call of the Prophet. By the middle of the 15th century, the power and wealth of Kano had grown to a point at which a new and enterprising ruler needed to develop more modern forms of government. Mohammed Runfa, one of the most famous kings of the old Harbi dynasty, sent for a North African expert in Muslim law and custom named Al-Maghili. Al-Haji Maita Masuli explains.
Sheikh Maghili, after having studied and after having become very learned and world famous in Islamic studies, decided to come to this part of the country to establish himself, which he did in Kano. He came during the reign of Muhammad Rumfa, a very well-known, very famous, and very scholarly emir of Kano during the Harbi days.
Al-Maghili advised the king to set an example to his people in religious matters, since religion and authority went together. The king enforced the Sharia, the Muslim legal code, and formed a panel of Islamic judges, the Qadis, to preside over the courts. The present Chief Qadi of Kano, Dr. Hassan Gwazo, is an expert on Al-Maghili's teachings.
In fact, he devised two types of courts, that is courts of first instance and also court of appeal. The court of first instance were the courts to be mended by the Qadis, but the court of appeal was that of the emir himself, that is the emir in council, that is people aggrieved by the decisions of the Qadis or by the attitude of any official of the emir, have got a right to go direct to the emir himself.
In a book called The Obligations of Princes, Al-Maghili set down a number of rules for the king to follow in the affairs of state.
He warned the ruler that he shouldn't content himself with informations brought to him by his officials, because he said, because sometimes complaints might be against the officials, and therefore the emir should be always accessible, and that is why we see in the history of kingship in Kano, from those days to this present time, that the emir has the practice of coming out, always sitting in a place where everybody can see him, and you can see that this is even done even today.
But if justice was in theory available to everyone, it was also sharply administered. The king and his council had the same power of life and death as their contemporaries in Europe.
He had the power to say if somebody had killed somebody, or the emir, and together with his legal advisors, would go through the case, and then if that person was absolutely guilty, the emir would send him to the hanging place. He had his head cut off.
The authority of the king was very great, but like other African kings of that time, including those of Benin and Oyo, he could not be a despot. He administered the law, but he also had to obey it. He ruled his council, but he also had to defer to it. In some ways, African kingdoms were ahead of those in Europe in devising checks and balances to limit the power of the king. Al-Magili was building on earlier traditions of African political administration when he made rules for the exercise of royal power.
Then later he wrote a constitution. And it was in this constitution that he provided for the establishment of a public complaints commission, Wilayat al-Muzalim, in Arabic, which literally means public complaints commission, the institution of ombudsman. So you see, about 500 years ago, even more, we had this institution of ombudsman in Hausa land.
But the king remained at the center of all things, especially at the center of spiritual power. For the celebration of a major religious festival, the king still leads the prayers of his people. Yet men don't live by prayer alone. The coming of Islam also helped to improve business dealings with Muslim merchants and traders right across northern and western Africa. Kano and its neighboring city-states lived within a wide regional community of productive interchange of manufactures, people and ideas. They were fortunate in being placed in a land that lay between the frontiers of large empires. On the east, the Kanuri Empire of Kanem and of Bornu, and on the west, the ancient Mandinka Empire of Mali and the Sonrai Empire of the Middle Niger. The expanding production and trade of all these famous countries of the old Sudan enclosed the Hausa within a far-ranging network of caravan trails and transport. Camels provided the essential haulage system for a flourishing import-export business. Kano prospered as a commercial center. In the market, a leather worker hand-stitches part of a camel saddle, one of many highly prized products which established Kano's reputation for skilled craftsmanship and manufacture. Kano leatherwork became so famous that it was traded across the Sahara as far as Morocco. From there it was sold again to Europe, even to buyers in England, where it became known as Morocco leather. Saddle blankets of quilted cotton, still made in Kano, have always been a valued item of trade and manufacture. Another textile unique to the Kano area was once so much in demand that it was traded the length and breadth of the Western Sudan. The story of these tightly woven rolls of cloth demonstrates the complexity and sophistication of traditional Kano industry. First, the weavers turn out long strips of white cloth on the narrowest looms anywhere in the world, a technique which produces an extremely dense weave. In the village of Kura, just outside Kano city, the strips of cloth are then sold to local businessmen. At this stage, they look like long, narrow bandages. The cloth buyers then arrange for the strips to be sewn together into broad widths of material. These are then taken to the nearby village of Bunkare for the next stage of the process. Dyeing with indigo is another ancient craft, long carried out in the Kano region. Here again one sees how Africans have evolved their own techniques for specific needs. In this case, the need has been, and still is, to produce a fine, darkly dyed material for buyers far and wide, but especially for the Tuareg of the Sahara Desert, who long ago adopted it as their traditional dress. The process has to be repeated over and over. The longer the process, the deeper the dye. Simple though the technique may appear to be, this is only one of several stages of manufacture. Periodically sprayed with water and pounded for hours on end, the finished product acquires a sheen that's much admired. It's this highly polished blue cloth which is then traded out of Kano market to make turbans for local dignitaries and veils for the Tuareg, the blue men of the desert. The manufacture and sale of textiles has been a staple industry in the villages around Kano for many centuries. Strips from looms like this, when sewn together into broad widths, were sold as robes or blankets to every people and kingdom in Western Africa. Here then was a nicely balanced community of interests between countryside and city, between producers and consumers. Industry and commerce guaranteed the city's prosperity. Whole villages which once were part of the Kano kingdom are given over to the manufacture of pottery. Once the pots are dried, they're taken to a central kiln for firing. Here, literally hundreds of pots can be fired at the same time, a cooperative system for the mass production of cooking vessels. Governing and exploiting all this industry and trade were the king and his council. The king enjoyed great wealth and enormous prestige. He was always the center of attention, surrounded by courtiers and officials. He could never afford to relax, even when confronted by the grotesque mockery of his jester. But alone in the royal garden within the palace walls, he could be his own man. Sheltered from his subjects, the king could try his hand at manual labor. Women are rarely seen by visitors to the palace. These women, entertaining themselves in